I never thought I'd be the kind of person who believed in fate. But then again, I never thought I'd spend 3 months in a cabin in the woods with someone who would completely change the way I saw everything. My name is Adrian, and this is the story of how a random work assignment turned into the most important summer of my life. It started with an email from my boss at the environmental research firm where I'd been working for about 2 years. They needed someone to head up to a remote monitoring station in northern Oregon to collect data on watershed quality and forest health. 3 months, decent pay, and basically living off the grid. I was 26, single, and honestly just looking for an excuse to get away from the city for a while. My last relationship had ended badly 6 months earlier, and I was still in that weird phase where everything reminded me of what I'd lost. So I said yes without really thinking it through. What they didn't mention in that first email was that I wouldn't be going alone. 2 days before I was supposed to leave, I got another message saying they were sending someone else too. A guy named Miles from the Portland office who had more experience with the equipment we'd be using. I felt a weird twist in my stomach when I read that. I'd been picturing this solitary experience, just me and nature, and a lot of time to think. But I guess it made sense. The station was pretty isolated, and having 2 people there was probably safer. I met Miles for the first time at the trailhead where we were supposed to meet our guide, who would help us haul our supplies up to the cabin. I got there first, and I was standing by my truck checking my pack for the 3rd time, when I heard another vehicle pull up. I turned around and saw this guy getting out of a beat-up Subaru, and I swear something in my chest did this strange little flip that I immediately tried to ignore. He was tall, maybe 6'1" or 6'2", with dark hair that was a little too long and kept falling into his eyes. He had on worn jeans and a faded green flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and when he walked over to me, I noticed he had these really intense hazel eyes that seemed to actually see you when he looked at you. Not just look at you, but see you. Does that make sense? It probably sounds stupid, but that was my first impression. "Hey, you must be Adrian," he said, and his voice was deeper than I expected, warm and a little rough around the edges. "I'm Miles." He stuck out his hand and I shook it, and I remember thinking his grip was firm and his palm was calloused, the hands of someone who actually worked with them. "Yeah. Hey, nice to meet you," I said, and I tried to sound casual and professional, like I wasn't suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was standing and the way his shirt fit across his shoulders. I chalked it up to just being nervous about the assignment. That's all it was, right? Just nerves. The hike up to the cabin took about 4 hours, and Miles and I didn't talk much at first. We were both focused on the trail, and our packs were heavy, and the guide, this grizzled guy named Tom who'd been working in these mountains for 30 years, kept a pretty quick pace. But during our breaks, Miles would make these little observations about the forest, pointing out different tree species or the way the light came through the canopy, and I found myself watching him more than I was watching the forest. He had this way of getting excited about things. His whole face would light up when he talked about something he found interesting, and it was kind of infectious. When we finally got to the cabin, I was exhausted and sweaty and ready to collapse, but I had to admit the place was pretty perfect. It was small, basically just one large room with 2 narrow beds on opposite walls, a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area, and a desk where we'd set up our computers and equipment. There was a separate small structure out back that served as a bathroom and shower, fed by a rain collection system. No electricity except what we could generate with solar panels and a small generator. No internet, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. Tom helped us unload our supplies and gave us a rundown of how everything worked. Then he headed back down the mountain, and suddenly it was just me and Miles, standing in this tiny cabin, looking at each other, both of us probably realizing that we were going to be spending the next 3 months in very close quarters with someone we just met. "So," Miles said after a long moment of silence, "you want the bed by the window or the one by the stove?" His tone was light, trying to break the awkwardness, and I appreciated it. "Window's fine," I said, and we both started unpacking our stuff, moving around each other in the small space, and I tried not to think about how aware I was of his presence, the sound of him moving, the occasional brush of his arm against mine when we passed each other. That first night, we made dinner together, nothing fancy, just pasta and sauce from a jar, and we sat at the small table and talked about the work we'd be doing, the schedule we'd need to keep, practical stuff. But I kept noticing these little things about him, the way he pushed his hair back from his forehead, the small scar on his left hand, the fact that he was left-handed, the way he listened when I talked, really listened, like what I was saying actually mattered. I went to bed that night and lay there in the darkness, listening to him breathing on the other side of the room, and I had this strange feeling in my chest that I couldn't quite name. I told myself I was just adjusting to the situation, to having a roommate again after living alone for so long. But somewhere deep down, in a place I wasn't quite ready to look yet, I think I knew it was something more. The days fell into a rhythm pretty quickly. We'd wake up early, usually around 6, and take turns making coffee on the camp stove. Then we'd head out to check the monitoring equipment, collect water samples, record data. The work was physical and demanding, lots of hiking through rough terrain, but it was also beautiful. I'd never spent that much time in real wilderness before, and there was something about it that got into your blood, the silence and the smell of pine and earth and the way the light changed throughout the day. Miles was easy to work with. He was competent and didn't complain and had this dry sense of humor that caught me off guard sometimes, making me laugh when I least expected it. We developed this comfortable pattern of working together, anticipating what the other person needed, moving in sync without having to say much. It felt natural, effortless, and I started to look forward to our days in a way that had nothing to do with the work itself. But it was the evenings that really got to me. After dinner, we'd sit outside on the small porch if the weather was nice, or inside by the stove if it wasn't, and we'd just talk. Not about anything profound at first, just regular stuff. Our lives back home, our families, stupid things we'd done in college, movies we liked, places we wanted to travel someday. But gradually, over days and then weeks, the conversations went deeper. Miles told me about his parents' divorce when he was 12, how it had kind of broken something in him for a while, made him not trust that anything good could last. He told me about his ex-girlfriend who he'd almost married, how he'd realized at the last minute that he was doing it because it was what he was supposed to do, not because it was what he actually wanted. He talked about feeling lost sometimes, like he was going through the motions of a life that didn't quite fit. And I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with anyone in years. I told him about my dad dying when I was 19, how I still missed him every day, how sometimes I'd think of something I wanted to tell him and then remember he wasn't there anymore. I told him about my last boyfriend, which was the first time I'd explicitly mentioned being gay, and I watched Miles's face carefully when I said it, looking for any sign of judgment or discomfort. But there was nothing like that. He just nodded and asked me what had happened, and I told him how we'd wanted different things, how I'd wanted something real and lasting, and he just wanted to keep things casual and undefined. "I'm sorry," Miles said quietly. That must have hurt. And the way he said it, the genuine empathy in his voice, made my throat tight. "Yeah," I said. It did. We sat in silence for a while after that, and I was acutely aware of how close he was sitting to me, our shoulders almost touching on the narrow porch bench. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and I could smell the wood smoke from someone's distant campfire mixing with the scent of pine and the soap Miles used. I wanted to say something else, to fill the silence, but I also didn't want to break whatever this moment was. "You know what's weird?" Miles said finally, still looking out at the darkening forest. "I feel like I can talk to you about anything, like I've known you for years instead of just a few weeks." He turned to look at me then, and his eyes were serious, searching. "Is that strange?" No, I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. I feel the same way. Something passed between us in that moment. Something I couldn't quite name but felt all through my body like an electric current. Miles held my gaze for a few seconds longer, and I saw something flicker in his expression, something that might have been recognition or maybe fear, and then he looked away and cleared his throat. "We should probably get some sleep," he said, standing up. "Early start tomorrow." Yeah, I agreed, even though I wasn't tired at all, even though what I really wanted was to keep sitting there with him, talking and not talking, existing in that charged space between us. As the weeks went by, I became increasingly aware that what I was feeling for Miles wasn't just friendship. It was more than that, deeper than that, and it scared me because I couldn't control it. I'd catch myself watching him when he wasn't looking, memorizing the line of his jaw, the way his hands moved when he was explaining something, the sound of his laugh. I'd lie awake at night listening to him sleep, wanting to cross the small space between our beds and just be close to him, which was completely insane because he'd never given me any indication that he felt the same way, that he was even interested in guys at all. But then there were these moments that made me wonder. The time he put his hand on my lower back to steady me when I was climbing over some rocks, and left it there a few seconds longer than necessary. The way he'd smile at me sometimes, soft and almost tender, like I was something precious. The fact that he'd started sitting closer to me in the evenings, close enough that our knees would touch, and he never moved away. One night, about 6 weeks into our stay, we were sitting by the stove because it was raining hard outside, and we'd been passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth that Miles had stashed in his pack. We were both a little drunk, that pleasant, buzzy feeling where everything seems funnier and more profound than it actually is. And we were talking about the future, what we wanted our lives to look like. "I don't want to just exist, you know," Miles said, staring into his cup. "I don't want to just go through the motions, work and sleep until I'm old and realize I never actually lived. I want something real, something that matters." "What does that look like for you?" I asked. "Something real." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought maybe he wasn't going to answer, but then he said, "I think it looks like this, actually. Being in a place that's beautiful, doing work that means something, being with someone who actually sees you." He paused, took another sip of whiskey. "I've been thinking lately that maybe I've been looking for the wrong things my whole life. Maybe what matters isn't the big impressive stuff, the career or the status or whatever. Maybe it's just finding someone who makes you want to be better, who you can build something with. Something small and real and yours." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I wanted to ask him who he was thinking about when he said that, but I was afraid of the answer either way. Afraid he'd say someone back home, someone who wasn't me. Afraid he'd say it was me, and then what would I do with that information? "That sounds nice," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Miles looked at me then, really looked at me, and his eyes were so intense in the firelight that I had to fight the urge to look away. "Have you ever had that, Adrian? Someone who made you feel like you could build something real?" "I thought I did once," I said. But I was wrong. He didn't want the same things I wanted. And now I don't know. I'm trying to figure out if I'm brave enough to want it again, to risk that kind of hurt again. "You're one of the bravest people I know," Miles said, and he said it like he meant it, like it was just a fact. "The way you're so honest about who you are, what you want, the way you don't hide or pretend. That takes guts." "I don't feel brave," I admitted. "Most of the time I just feel scared." "Of what?" "Of wanting things I can't have," I said, and the words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. Miles didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me, and I could see him thinking, processing, maybe trying to decide something. Then he reached out and put his hand over mine where it was resting on my knee, and my entire body went rigid with the shock of that touch. "Adrian," he started, and his voice was shaking slightly. "I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to say it, so I'm just going to say it. These past few weeks with you, they've been the best weeks I can remember in a long time. And at first I told myself it was just the place, the break from normal life. But that's not true. It's you. You make everything better just by being in it, and I can't stop thinking about you. And I don't know what to do with that because I've never felt this way about a guy before, and I'm kind of terrified, but also I can't pretend anymore that I don't feel it." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he'd just said. He was still holding my hand, his thumb now moving in small circles over my knuckles, and I could see the vulnerability in his face, the fear of my reaction. "You feel what?" I asked, needing to hear him say it clearly, needing to be absolutely sure I wasn't misunderstanding. "I think I'm falling for you," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I think I might already have fallen for you, actually. And I don't know what that means or what we do about it, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." Something inside me broke open, like a dam giving way, and suddenly I was moving closer to him, closing the distance between us on the narrow bench. I raised my free hand to his face, cupping his jaw, and he leaned into my touch like he'd been waiting for it. "Miles," I breathed, "I've been falling for you since the day we got here. Maybe since the day we met. I've been going crazy trying to hide it, trying to convince myself you couldn't possibly feel the same way." He let out this shaky laugh that was almost a sob, and then he was leaning in, and I was leaning in, and our lips met in the middle, tentative at first, questioning, and then deeper as we both gave in to what we'd been holding back for weeks. He tasted like whiskey and something uniquely him, and kissing him felt like coming home, like finding something I'd been searching for without knowing I was searching. We pulled apart after a moment, both breathing hard, and Miles pressed his forehead against mine. "Is this crazy?" he whispered. "Are we crazy?" "Probably," I said, and I couldn't stop smiling. "I don't care." We kissed again, slower this time, and then we just held each other, sitting there by the stove while the rain hammered on the roof, and I felt more certain of something than I'd felt about anything in years. The last month at the cabin was completely different from the first two. We were still doing our work, still maintaining our professional responsibilities, but everything was suffused with this new awareness, this joy that we couldn't quite contain. We'd hold hands on our hikes when no one was around to see. We'd kiss by the monitoring stations, hidden by trees. We'd fall asleep in the same narrow bed, tangled together, whispering about everything and nothing until we drifted off. Miles was different after we acknowledged our feelings. He was lighter somehow, more open, like he'd been carrying something heavy and had finally put it down. He told me about the confusion he had felt growing up, the sense that he was supposed to want certain things but never quite did. He talked about the relationships he'd had with women that had always felt like he was playing a role, going through the motions. He said being with me felt like finally being honest, finally being himself, and I was different too. I'd been so guarded after my last relationship, so afraid of getting hurt again, but with Miles I felt safe enough to be completely vulnerable. I let him see all of me, the messy parts and the scared parts and the parts that wanted too much. And he didn't run. He stayed and saw me and loved me anyway. One evening, about a week before we were supposed to leave, we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, and Miles was quiet in a way that felt thoughtful rather than distant. I was leaning against him, his arm around my shoulders, and I was thinking about how much I didn't want this to end, how much I dreaded going back to our separate lives in different cities. "I've been thinking," Miles said finally, and there was something in his voice that made me sit up and look at him, "about what happens when we leave here." My stomach tightened with anxiety. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. I don't want this to be just a summer thing, Adrian. I don't want to go back to our normal lives and pretend this didn't happen or that it was just some isolated experience that doesn't count in the real world. He turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his. I want to build something with you, something real and lasting. I want that too, I said, relief flooding through me. But how does it work? You're in Portland, I'm in Seattle. That's like 3 hours apart. So one of us moves, Miles said, like it was obvious. Or we both move somewhere new, start fresh together. I don't care where I live as long as I'm with you. You'd do that, just uproot your whole life. For you? Yeah, I would. Without question. He smiled, that soft smile that I'd come to love so much. Actually, I've been having this fantasy lately. You want to hear it? Always, I said. I want to build us a house someday, he said, and his eyes were bright with the vision of it. Not right away, obviously, but someday. Maybe somewhere like this. Somewhere with trees and space and quiet. I want to build it with my own hands, or at least help build it. I want it to have big windows so we can see the forest, and a porch where we can sit and watch the sun go down. I want a garden and maybe some chickens and a dog. I want to wake up with you every morning and know that we built this life together, that it's ours. Does that sound stupid? No, I said, and my voice was thick with emotion. It sounds perfect. It sounds like everything I want too. He kissed me then, sweet and slow, and I thought about the future he was describing, about building something together, about choosing each other every day. It felt possible in a way nothing had felt possible in a long time. When we finally left the cabin, hiking back down that same trail we'd climbed 3 months earlier, I felt like a completely different person than the one who'd arrived. I was holding Miles's hand as we walked, not caring who might see, and he was telling me about apartments in Portland we could look at, or maybe something in Seattle, or maybe somewhere in between. We were making plans, real concrete plans, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. That was 2 years ago. We ended up moving to Portland together, found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood with good light. Miles transferred to the Seattle office eventually so he could be closer to me, and I found a job with an environmental non-profit that let me do field work a few times a year. We're saving up now, putting money aside every month, and we spend our weekends looking at land, dreaming about the house Miles promised me that night on the cabin porch. It hasn't always been easy. We've had fights and doubts and moments where we both wondered if we were moving too fast or wanting too much. Coming out to our families was hard for Miles, harder than it was for me because I'd already done it years before. His parents took a while to come around, but they're trying now, and that's something. We've had to learn how to live together, how to navigate each other's habits and needs and bad days, but through all of it, I've never once doubted that he's the person I want to build my life with. Last month, Miles took me to look at a piece of property about an hour outside the city. 15 acres with a mix of forest and meadow, a small creek running through one corner, and a view of mountains in the distance. We walked the land together, talking about where we'd put the house, where the garden would go, how we'd design it to feel like the cabin where we fell in love, but bigger and more permanent. Standing there in that meadow with Miles's hand in mine, I thought about that first day at the trailhead when I'd been so nervous about spending 3 months with a stranger. I thought about how terrified I'd been of my feelings, how sure I was that I couldn't possibly be lucky enough to have them returned. I thought about all the small moments that had led us here, the conversations and touches and choices that had built this relationship between us, and I thought about what Miles had told me that night by the stove. About wanting something real, something you could build with your own hands. We're building it now, day by day, choice by choice. It's not always perfect and it's not always easy, but it's ours, and it's real, and it's exactly what I want. Miles turned to me in that meadow and said, "This could be it, Adrian. This could be where we build our house. What do you think?" And I said yes, because of course I said yes. I'll always say yes to building something with him, to choosing this life we're creating together. He's my person, the one I want to come home to, the one I want to grow old with in the house we'll build with our own hands. Sometimes, love finds you in the places you least expect it, in a tiny cabin in the woods where you're just trying to do your job and get through the day. Sometimes it looks like a stranger who becomes your best friend, who becomes the person you can't imagine living without. Sometimes it's quiet and gradual, building slowly until one day you realize you're so far gone there's no coming back, and you don't want to come back anyway. That's what it was like for me with Miles. That's what it still is. Every single day, I choose him, and he chooses me, and we keep building this life together, one small moment at a time. And someday soon, we'll break ground on that house he promised me, the one we'll fill with our life and our love and all the small, beautiful moments that make up a shared existence. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who believed in fate, but I do now. I believe Miles and I were meant to find each other in that cabin, meant to have those 3 months to fall in love, without the distractions of the outside world. I believe we're meant to build this life together, to create something lasting and real and ours. And I believe that sometimes, when you're brave enough to be honest about what you want, brave enough to risk your heart one more time, the universe gives you something better than you ever imagined. It gives you a person who sees you and chooses you and wants to build a house with you someday, a house that will be a home because you're in it together. That's my story. That's how I fell in love with my cabin mate, the man who promised to build us a house, the man who became my everything. And I wanted to share it because I think we all need to hear stories about love working out, about taking risks and being vulnerable and finding something real on the other side of fear. If my story can give even one person hope that they'll find their person too, then it was worth telling.